Good morning and happy Thursday from the Indian Rock Nature Preserve. My name is Lauren Pryor and we are outside today. And what we're going to be taking a look at today for our Facebook Live has to do with what I'm standing outside of. We're going to take a look into, but we can take a quick peek here. We are going to be talking about our sugar house here, our mobile maple sugar 1. And we're going to be talking about the maple sugaring process and how we take sap that we're collecting from one of our properties, the Hart property, from our sugar maple trees, and how we are turning that sap into syrup. So this sap that we want to collect starts with a tree. Let's get a look at one of our trees here. This is just a cut log that we have here at Indian Rock. We have one sugar maple tree, and it is actually right across there in the parking lot, but it is on its way out. So we use one of our other properties, the Hart property, to collect our sap. But what we want is we want sap from a maple tree, and we want sap specifically from the sugar maple tree. You can tap really any maple tree, but our sugar maple tree has the highest concentration of sugar already in that sap, and that highest concentration is still only 2 to 3% sugar. So getting the sugar maple sap kind of gives us that little ways up that we've already got a little bit more sugar in our sap, but it's still only 3% tops. So if we want sap from our sugar maple tree, we need to first identify a sugar maple tree. And when we're collecting sap, the thing is, the challenge is when we're collecting sap, it is in late February and in March. So when we look up at the trees, we've got a few oak trees here next to me. There's no leaves. We can hear some birds. There's some woodpeckers around. The red-winged blackbirds are starting to return to the lake here. But we've got no leaves, so we're kind of stuck identifying the sugar maple trees based off of a few other things, that being the bark, the branches, and the buds. So we've got 3 kind of key features of this tree that help us correctly ID it. But the thing is, trees, often their bark, okay, we have a few things on the bark here. These holes, we had this tree in one of our other demos, so these are just taps that some kids were doing this weekend. We have some lichen growing on the tree, but when we look at the bark on trees often change what it looks like based on the age of the tree. So as trees mature, their bark can change. So a lot of times the maple trees, the sugar maple trees, start off smooth, and as they age, they become more furrowed and cracked. Okay, this cutting of this kind of stump we have here is still relatively young. At 40 years old, our sugar maple trees can go to 250 to 300 years old. That's considered a very old sugar maple tree. So if we don't have leaves to ID the tree, okay, we have to go from the bark, the buds, and the branches. If we did have leaves, say we are looking at a sugar maple tree in the springtime, let's see, I'm going to pull up a picture here. We do have leaves, okay. When you look for a sugar maple tree, we have 5 lobes, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're pointed and they kind of have these U-shaped, okay, shallow U-shaped dents on them. But since we don't have leaves, we're stuck with the bark. Since the bark can be tricky, since it changes as it ages, okay, we look for the branches. So when we have a sugar maple tree branch, okay, maple trees have opposite branching patterns. So whatever grows on one side grows opposite too. Okay, whatever's growing on one side grows opposite here. Okay, let's see, we'll put it down. So we have opposite branching. They're always in pairs. One here, kind of broke off there. One here, one there. If we turn it, we see the same. Okay, so not a whole lot of tree species have the opposite branching pattern. So we have maples that have it, some ash trees, but there's not a whole repertoire of trees that have the opposite branching pattern. So if you at least find a tree that has opposite branching pattern, you at least narrow down your contending list of tree species. When we're in late February and in March, like we are when we're looking to tap our trees, we do see buds. Okay, our sugar maple tree buds, they're opposite, so they're paired. Okay, one growing on this side, one growing, camera's gotta focus. We always see that they're paired oppositely. Okay, color. All right, so you're looking for branches that are opposite in growth. What happens on one side happens on the other side. Buds are pointed and dark. If you do have an older sugar maple tree and you look at the bark, if you are looking at the bark, it's said that the sugar maple trees have orange underwear. So when you look very closely underneath, kind of into the crevices of the bark, it'll kind of have an orange color. Those are in the very old sugar maple trees. This one is still relatively young, at about 40 years old. Okay, we're about 10 inches across or so here. So we don't see much of that orange underwear underneath in the kind of the cracks of the bark. But when we are looking for a sugar maple tree to tap, we've got to follow a few rules. First, the tree's got to be 40 years old. So 40 years old, you can do one tap. The second thing is it's got to be at least 40 degrees. So we want the sap to be flowing. This happens when it is freezing at night, but the temperatures are a little bit warmer during the day, so into the 40s. So the sap, we'll flip it around again and look at our tree. We know our tree here is not a living. There's no roots, okay? But the sap would start down at the roots, okay? It starts off as starch that is being converted into sugar, into sucrose, starting in the roots. As the tree freezes and thaws, freezes at night and thaws during the day, the sucrose, the sugar and the sap, is going to start to come up the trunk of the tree. And it's going to start to disperse into the branches. We've got a makeshift branch into our trunk here. It would start to go into the branches to help those leaves start to grow. Okay, off of the buds here. So to collect that sap, we need to get into the tree. And we do see a few past taps here. This is just from a demo. In real life, if you're collecting sap, you would never drill this many taps into a tree, especially this young, especially that close to each other. But we just wanted the kids to have try their hand at tapping the tree, so at that point it didn't really matter, especially since this tree's not alive anymore. These taps, since this tree is only 40 years old, you can do one tap. As the tree gets older, you can add another tap. You kind of go off how wide the tree is. So if we're looking at a tree that's only 10, 11, 12 inches wide, you want to only do one tap. If the tree is, say, 22, 23, 24 inches wide, you can do two taps. As it gets wider and older, you can maybe add 3 taps. But they're never this close to each other when you're actually collecting. Okay, when you tap a tree, it will heal over, but it will create a scarring up and down the tree and a little over. So if we were to make this tap this year, we would want to go up and maybe over, and we would make a tap. Or over here, we want a nice clear space when we make our tap. So we would go kind of a foot up or so, maybe a foot and a half up or so, and then over, and we would put a tap here next year. And when you tap a tree that is living, you would see sap start to drip as it comes out. When we tap our trees, we use a hand drill. You can use electric drills. But when you put your drill in, okay, you're not going deep into the tree, only about 2 inches or so. I just put into a tap that was already kind of made. But you can start to see some of the wood chips starting to come out, and they just fall on the ground, no problem. You only go about 2 inches in, That's all that's really needed to access that sap. You would take your drill out. And again, if this was a living tree, we would start to see the sap flow. This tree is not living, it's just a stump, so we don't see any flowing sap. But what we would then do, we would take a spile. Okay, think of it as like a little tree faucet. And we would put our spile into our tap. We would put it in there. And we want to make sure it's sturdy. So to make sure it's nice and sturdy, and if this was a flowing tree, we would start to see it dripping out. We would just give it a tap with your hammer until it's nice and sturdy. And then to collect that sap, you would then hang a bucket. Okay, you can hang a bucket. You would put a lid on this to prevent any debris, dirt falling in, keep animals out. Or you could use tubing, okay, instead of buckets if you have a big operation, a big sugar bush, lots of sugar maple trees growing together. If you don't want to put out 100 buckets, you would just put a tube here, and the tubes would all connect together and go into one central collection bucket. Okay, so we have our rule of 40s. Our tree's got to be at least 40 years old to make one tap. It's got to be 40 degrees for that sap to be flowing. And it takes 40 of these buckets to make one bucket of syrup. So 40 gallons of sap to 1 gallon syrup is the ratio. Because remember, we have 3% sugar in that sap. The rest is water. We want to turn that 3% sugar into 67% sugar. So how we do that is we evaporate. We use the evaporator to boil off a bunch of that water. So we are going to go into our little sugar house and we're going to learn about that process. And that little bucket would fill up within a day. We're collecting hundreds of gallons of sap. Okay, and once we have sap, actually if we go back outside real quick, we can see our big 150 gallon container of sap. You can see the sap line there. That's just the sap we've collected so far. So that sap comes in through our tubing, our piping, and it enters the evaporator. So here's the process where we turn that 3% sugar, 97% water sap into 67% sugar, okay? So we need to get rid of a lot of that excess water. So this sap, when it comes in, it's a little cloudy. Looks like cloudy water. The cloudiness is caused by the sugar that's in there. Okay, and we want to boil this sap by lighting a fire. So this evaporator is fueled by wood. It is not running right now, just for the sake that there would be a lot of steam in our sugar house and it would be hard to kind of see inside the evaporator. But it is fueled by a fire. Okay, there's nothing in it right now, but our wood goes in there. Okay, what you can see underneath here, okay, we see flues. That gives the fire, the heat, more kind of surface area to heat up the sap so it can boil. Okay, and then it's just got an ash collection down at the bottom. Okay, so it is fueled by wood, but our sap flows in. It's gonna enter our pans here, our back pans. And this is where it's going to start to boil. So as it goes through, okay, it enters over here, and it's going to flow inside here. There is sap in here right now, but there's a little opening down there so it can enter and flow. Okay, there's a little opening down there so it can enter and flow. And then eventually on this side, it exits and flows over here. Okay, so it's flowing based off of the gradient, the sugar content, as the sugar content gets higher. So we're evaporating, we're boiling off the water, we're increasing the sugar concentration. Okay, as we get over here, we can start to see, we're seeing a lot of reflection because there is sap in there. Okay, but as we get over here, as we go further and further through the evaporator, it does start to get dark. And we're looking for this sap to get to 7 degrees above the boiling point of water. So the boiling point of water is 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So we want to add 7 degrees to that. You've got a thermometer. Remember, nothing's running right now, so that's why it's well below 0, but we want to get it to the 7. So it's at 219 degrees, and at that point, we are done. Sometimes we take the sap and we might move it to a smaller boiling container that's kind of powered by gas, so we can control it better. We can see it's nice and there's a good reflection, but it is nice and brown. The darker the syrup, as it turns into syrup, as the sugar becomes more concentrated, the darker the syrup, the more maple flavor it is. Here's our wood pile ready to go for today. We have a volunteer that's going to be in here all day boiling our sap, so it is very much watching a pot boil. Okay, and as we get our sap, we have to grate it. So before we can bottle it, we have to filter it to get out any what we call sugar sand. Okay, so we filter it because we don't want it gritty. Let's see, if we hold it up to the sunlight, we can see the difference in colors there. So the darker the syrup, we have to grate it so we compare our syrup to different colors. Usually our syrup ends up being a little bit darker. Okay, but the darker the syrup, the more maple flavor it is. And then we bottle it, and we bottle it hot. So it sterilizes the container as it goes in. And that's how we get we go from our sap to our syrup that we can enjoy on our breakfast and our foods. We are having a pancake breakfast coming up on Saturday, March 20th. We are doing, it is a pre-order takeout, but we are doing the maple sugaring demos. Okay, so you can go onto our website, the Environmental Learning Centers of Connecticut, elcct.org, to register for this event. So you can purchase some Saturday morning breakfast for you and your family, as well as see the sugaring maple demo. And then we're also going to be demoing some alternative ways that we boil sap, like how the first Americans did it and how colonials did it. But that is on Saturday, March 20th. You can register on our website, elcct.org. And at that event, you can purchase the sap, or the syrup made from the sap that we have collected and made here on the preserve, and you can enjoy it on your breakfast. But in a nutshell, that is a very quick way of how we turn sap to syrup. But the process, there's not a lot of steps to the process, but it is a long process just because we have to sit here and watch it boil. We don't want it over boiling when it gets really foamy, and we don't want to run out of sap when there's still a fire going, or else we will burn the pans and that will ruin the flavor of the syrup. So it is very much watching a pot boil all day long. So all in all, our sap comes from the sugar maple trees. We use the sugar maple trees because it has the highest concentration of sugar in that sap, only being maximum 3%. We tap into the tree when the sap is flowing. That ends up being late February through March, when the nights are freezing but the days are a little warmer, about 40 degrees. We have to wait until a sugar maple tree is 40 years old to tap it. It's about 10 inches across when it's 40 years old. You can tap it once when it's 40, and then add more taps as it matures and gets bigger. Once we collect that sap with the buckets or tubing, we bring it into our evaporator, and we just sit here to watch the majority of the water boil off as steam to get that 3% sugar content all the way up to 67. And we can test that Well, first we wait for it to reach 219 degrees Fahrenheit, and then we also test it with a precision hydrometer. Okay. But that's our process of sap to syrup. We're going to be back next Tuesday on the Environmental Learning Centers of Connecticut Facebook page at 10 a.m. for another Facebook Live. And make sure you go on to our website, elcct.org, to sign up for our pancake breakfast on Saturday, March 20th. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next week.